Okei. Nitaniko Enkki. Hello, my name is Grant Manyheads. In Blackfoot, I said my name means singer, so that's what Enkki means. So my Blackfoot name means singer. But you can call me Grant Manyheads, and I'm one of the interpreters here at Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park. Today I want to welcome you to another episode of Blackfoot History. And today we're going to be talking in particular about the fur trade and how it affected the Blackfoot speaking peoples. But like usual, before we actually get into that part of the history program, we want to talk about the Blackfoot people, the Siksikaitsitapiiks, and Gitawasan, meaning our homeland. So right now, let's learn a little bit about who the Blackfoot speaking peoples are. I kind of want to point out in some of the tours that we've had lately, we've had people call us names such as Pagan or Blackfeet or other names such as Bloods. All of these names are all accurate, but if you truly want to know who the Blackfoot speaking peoples are, then it's best to know who we are by tribe. And here on this particular image here, these are the 4 Blackfoot speaking tribes that exist here in North America today who make up the Siksikaitsitapiiks, or the Blackfoot speaking peoples. Sometimes this organization is known as the Blackfoot Confederacy, but that's not totally accurate because the Confederacy would include other tribes such as the Tsuut'ina, or in ancient times the Groven or Arapaho people. But today we only have one of those tribes who was our ally right up until the time of the signing of Treaty Number 7. But it's more accurate to call ourselves Siksikaitsitapi, meaning Blackfoot speaking peoples, and let's look at those 4 tribes right now. Now where we are located, actually this is Piikani, or they're also known as the Pagan. Now these people actually live on a reservation reserve that's located near present-day Brockett. That's kind of near Pincher Creek. Now this is where they're living today. I guess you would say in our language, Apatusi Piikani or Skinny Piikani, meaning that they're behind the rest of the Blackfoot tribes, kind of near the mountains. And so this is one tribe here in Canada. If we look at the next image, here's our sister tribe. This is who we are. Where the Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park is located is on the Siksika Nation, or the Siksika Reserve. And Siksika is actually just, I guess how you would say it in English, you would translate it as Blackfoot, singular, 1 foot, not feet, Blackfoot. But this is a second Blackfoot speaking tribe. If we look at the next image, we can actually see the Agena, or blood tribe as they're known. In our language, Agena means many leaders or many chiefs. So this tribe was known because there was many tribes and many chieftains that came from this particular tribe. So this is the other sister tribe. Now the next image is the Amskapi Piikani. Now these Piikani are the same as the Northern Piikani. They're the same tribe, but over time there were so many of them that there was a group that stayed in the northern part, what we call Canada today, and then there was the Southern Piikani who were living south of the border or the medicine line. And so these people we call Amskapi, because Amskapi in Blackfoot actually means across. So when we say Amskapi Piikani, we're saying those Piikani living across the border or across the medicine line. So altogether, these 4 tribes make up the Blackfoot speaking peoples, or the Siksikaitsitapiiks. And in the next image, you can see those 4 tribes. And here are their different flags that represent those different First Nations. And like I mentioned, all together, the Gena, the Siksika, Piikani, Amskapi Piikani, together we make up the Blackfoot speaking people, or the Siksikaitsitapiiks. So now at this image, we're looking at a buffalo. Now this animal was our staff of life, the plains bison in particular. So wherever this animal went, we followed. And wherever in the northern plains that the animal happened to go to, our people followed at first on foot, like in the dog days. Literally, the dog days existed from the very existence of our people right up until the time of the introduction of the horse. So up until that time, our people lived in the dog days, which was literally thousands and thousands of years. And it wasn't only until the 17th century that when the horse came that our lifestyle changed. So let's look at the next image. So like I mentioned, ini, or the plains bison, this was our staff of life because it provided the Siksikaitsitapiiks, or the Blackfoot speaking people, with food, with shelter, and with clothing. But the clothing was pretty much only winter clothing and bedding. That's what we used the buffalo for. When it came to our day-to-day wear, we'd use pelts of other animals, such as deer, or antelope, or elk, these type of other animals. But to the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, this animal, our staff of life, ini, it also had hundreds of other uses to our people. So long as this animal existed in its millions, our people had no want. Even when the traders came, we really didn't need the trade goods. All we needed was the buffalo. So wherever the great northern herds roamed, our people followed them. So Kitawasinun, our homeland, it wasn't defined by the Blackfoot people so much as it was defined by the buffalo, our ini. Because, as I mentioned, wherever this animal roamed, we followed it. So in fact, the Blackfoot people, we don't say that this land belongs to us. What we say is that we are the people of the land of the buffalo, if you wanted to translate that into English. So we are the people of the land of the buffalo. Let's actually move on to the next image. So we spoke about the dog days. Now in the dog days, our people traveled only short distances at a time. But so long as we could see iniksi, or the buffalo herds, we were happy. As long as they were within sight, we were happy. And we would follow them on foot all over our lands. So let's kind of talk about a little bit about our lands. Let's move on to the next image. Now, Kitawasinun, our homeland, it actually started, if you will, from the Rocky Mountains, and in our language we'd say Mistakkists. And that kind of means the backbone of the earth. So from the backbone of the earth all the way east, almost to the Manitoba Escarpment, right around the Touchwood Hills, the Qu'Appelle Valley, Nut Mountain, up near Prince Albert, all of these areas, this is how far east the Blackfoot lands went. And then from the North Saskatchewan up top there, where present-day Rocky Mountain House, Edmonton, Batoche, Prince Albert, from the North Saskatchewan River all the way south down to the Yellowstone River. Well, all the lands in between those green borders you see on that map, this is what the Blackfoot people considered our sacred lands, our homeland. So we actually lived not just along the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, but we actually lived also on the other side of the Rocky Mountains and all the way down into like the Bitterroot Valley in present-day Missoula, Montana, or Kalispell, Montana. So our people actually lived in a huge, vast area. And this area was filled with mountains, with foothills, and with flat prairie or plains lands. So the Blackfoot lands, our homeland, included a vast, vast area of land which included all of these different types of geography. So here we can see actually another map of the Blackfoot lands, and as I mentioned, all along the backbone of the earth our people knew of. So from the Yukon, and we don't usually talk about it here, but from the Yukon all the way down to Mexico, there's a road that they call the Old North Trail. And it's because of this Old North Trail that our Blackfoot-speaking peoples knew our lands. Like I mentioned, from the North Saskatchewan all the way to the Yellowstone, and from the Rocky Mountains pretty much all the way to the Manitoba Escarpment. These are the lands that the Blackfoot people considered our homeland. So actually let's move on to the next image. Now the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, we were at first a people without horses. So when we wandered all over these lands that we spoke of, we did it on foot originally. And that's how the Blackfoot people got to know our land so intimately. We knew all the places where you could go to find plants, medicines, lodgepole pine, all sorts of foraging plants we knew where to find, but also we knew where to find water, good water. And we also knew where all the bad water was, the alkali lakes, all of the sort of places where you couldn't really make use of some of the materials. But we knew our land so well that we knew all of these different places. So, as I mentioned, one of the reasons why we knew our land so well is because in the dog days, when our people were on foot, as you can see in the image there, and the dog was our only beast of burden, well, we had to walk all over those vast lands that you'd seen on the preceding map. And once we did that, we kind of got an idea, a pretty good idea of where all the resources were. So here we see another image of a Blackfoot rendition of us being in the dog days, and with a person moving from one place to another, and there you have the dogs, more wolf-like than anything, not like your Chihuahuas or American Jack Russell Terriers or anything like that, which are actually pretty small. These dogs are closer to wolves, and these dogs could carry anywhere from 80 to 100 pounds. So they were pretty big dogs. And each family would probably have 5 to 10 of them to be able to move their goods over the prairies. And just a note, in those days, in the dog days when we were nomadic pedestrians, we probably only traveled as much as 3 to 5 miles a day, because you're only as fast as the slowest member of your group. So we wouldn't have been able to travel vast distances, particularly because we were pedestrian. So let's look at the next image. Well, so this lifestyle, this changed from the dog days almost overnight, because once this animal was introduced to us, which people know as the horse, but the Blackfoot know this animal as punogomita. Now, when we first saw this animal, we had no idea what to call it. But all we knew, it was as big as an elk, and in our language we say punoka for an elk, and it was a slave to man, like a dog. And so we call our dogs imita. Well, we kind of put the two words together, punoka, imita. We put them together and we come up with the word punogomita, meaning elk dog. And to this day, our people still call this creature punogomita, the elk dog. And to the Blackfoot, this is a sacred creature. Now, this animal, or this creature, was actually introduced to us around the 1700s. And we say circa 1700s because no one really knows. There is an account by David Thompson of the Blackfoot maybe obtaining the horses around 1720 or so. But he was only talking to one Blackfoot group, and that was the Piikani. Now, as you've learned, there are 4 different Blackfoot tribes. So there are other Blackfoot tribes who talk about receiving the horse earlier than the Piikani. And the Blood tribe have such a story. So all we know is that when the Blackfoot received this animal, the horse, it had to have happened around the 17th century, give or take a few years, just around that particular time. But when this animal came to the Blackfoot speaking peoples, it changed our life on an incredible scale, a fundamental change. So let's actually move on to the next image. Now, hot on the heels, as they say it, hard on the heels of the new horse culture came the Napiquans and their trade goods. And basically Napiquans in our language means those people who look like our trickster deity Napi, or Napi's people, is the word we came up with to describe Europeans, or those people that didn't look like us, but looked like Napi. Now let me just tell you a quick little story. To the Blackfoot speaking peoples, before we ever met a European face to face, we had stories of Napi. And Napi had a particular look to him. Everything that he wore was white. All his clothes were white, his leggings were white, his war shirt was white. Even his hair was either light or white, and his eyes were like the rainbow or like flashing lightning. So they were colored. So the first Blackfoot who met the first white man, who was a Frenchman, on the North Saskatchewan River, must have thought that he had met Napi. And then when he looked at that person's companions, he would have realized they can't all be Napi. These must be Napi's people. So they were called Napiquans, Napi's people. And not just because they looked like Napi, but because these Napiquans came with these trade goods. Now you have to understand that our people had never seen these sort of items before. Now, in the ancient days, our people used to use things such as boiling pits to boil our food, to boil meat, to render glue, or to get the bone marrow out of broken bones. This is what we used boiling pits, an all-day process. Usually took you 6 to 8 hours just to get something boiling. Well, then all of a sudden, these trade goods arrived to us: pots, pans, kettles. And once our mothers and grandmothers got these pots, pans, and kettles and were able to boil things in them, well, things like the boiling pit became obsolete. We no longer use these sort of methods to boil our food. So in effect, what these trade goods did was made life easier for our people. Not just the pots and pans, but also the trade cloth. Now, if any of you have ever worked with leather, it takes a lot of hand power. It takes a lot of punching holes with awls through it just to connect pieces, etc. Well, all of a sudden, the traders came with the trade cloth. Now, all grandma has to do is cut out a pattern and use a needle and thread and put it together. And so our people are able to make beautiful capote jackets like you see there, our leggings, are all sorts of clothing for our people. And this is what our grandmothers and mothers were able to do with this trade cloth. And in fact, this trade cloth, these blankets to this day are still one of the gifts that you would give somebody, an honored elder or a dignitary, because what the blanket means to the Blackfoot people then and still means today is that that gift means I care about that person. So if you care about that person, you give them a blanket. Now, this became undercloth, so you can see how these trade goods made life a whole lot easier for our people. Hence the reason we wanted more and more trade goods, and we would befriend those native tribes, those middlemen in trade, as we learned about. Those middlemen in trade were actually welcome into our tribal lands because they were bringing these same trade goods. Now actually, let's move on to the next image. Now, we did receive our first trade goods from the middlemen in trade before we actually met the quote unquote white men face to face and started trading with them regularly. Now let's talk a little bit about Rupert's Land for those of you who may not know. Now in 1670, King Charles II of England, he granted a royal charter to his cousin, the Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Now, this charter created the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670. And basically all of those lands, all of those rivers, streams, creeks, and everything that drained into the Hudson's Bay, these lands were given to this Prince Rupert of the Rhine by his cousin, King Charles II of England. So these decisions obviously were arbitrarily made far away from Blackfoot eyes, and we had no participation in any of this. So we wouldn't have known there was even such a thing called Rupert's Land. Well, anyways, because of this Rupert's Land, this is the reason why the English settled up in the Hudson's Bay, particularly York Factory. Now, if we look at this next image, you can kind of see this Rupert's Land. So all of those rivers, as I mentioned, and streams that all drain into the Hudson's Bay. Well, the Blackfoot Gitawasan, our lands, were basically a part of what this Rupert's Land, as they called it. So we can see sort of the reason why the British were out here. And they were out here for the same reason as the French. And both of these peoples were competing for small fur-bearing mammals for their fur trade, which was basically the fashion industry in Europe amongst the social elite. So let's move on to the next image. So at first, as we know, we had the Cree Assiniboine, who were the middlemen in trade. And this was basically from the time that the Hudson Bay set up in 1670 right up until 1786. Now during this time period, the Blackfoot received goods from the middlemen in trade. And the Cree Assiniboine made huge profits off of this middleman trade. And in fact, most of the goods that the Blackfoot received at this time were all secondhand goods, because it was very rare that the Cree or the Assiniboine would sell us brand new items. We usually got something that they had been using for 2 or 3 years before we received it, but we still paid huge amounts of furs for those trade goods. And these furs, they in turn took down to York Factory in exchange for newer items. So this middleman trade existed for about 100 years. And during this time, it's said that the Blackfoot tribes welcomed the Cree and Assiniboine onto our lands because they were coming to us with trade goods. Now, there was even a Blackfoot chief who said that the Blackfoot were always anxious to receive a Cree and Assiniboine because of this trade. We knew that when they were coming onto our lands, that more often than not, they were coming with some sort of trade item, be it a pot, pan, kettle, maybe a firearm, blanket, any number of these things. So our people, never seeing these things before, were curious, and they wanted to entertain those people who were coming in with these items. So during this time, our people made friendships with these middlemen in trade, and these middlemen in trade got to know our lands very, very well, moving right to the border and visiting with the Blackfoot tribes. So all of this activity was actually happening during these years. But interestingly enough, there were Blackfoot and blood who were going down to York Factory as early as 1707, about maybe 20, 30 years after they opened up on the Hudson's Bay, York Factory. So there were blood and there were Blackfoot tribes going down to York Factory as early as 1707. And we also know that there was quite a few of them that are actually going right up until about 1730. Now around this time, the Cree and the Assiniboine actually kind of blockaded because they did not want the Blackfoot receiving firearms. And so there was very limited the amount of firearms that the Blackfoot people got up until that time. Now, during this time, there was a lot of peace and a lot of friction between these tribes. As the Cree and the Assiniboine moved westward, they kind of drove a wedge between some other tribes. They got into conflicts with the Chippewa to the north of them, but also they got into conflicts with the Dene and the Deneta, the Dog Rib, and these tribes, as well as with the Tutena, or the Sarsi, or Tutena as they prefer to call themselves, outside of the city of Calgary. All of this conflict was actually happening around this time. It increased exponentially come the 18th century, but in the 17th century, 1700s, this was still kind of minimal. There's still kind of a little bit of a trade going on, good trade, but with friction beginning to develop. So this was all happening during the Cree Assiniboine middleman trade. Now things change, and let's look at the next image. Now we come to the Siksikaitsitapiiks trade, and particularly the fur trade and how it affected us. So let's look at the next image. Now, you have to understand that when the first Napequans began to trade with the Siksikaitsitapiiks on a regular basis in the 1780s, their companies, the Napequans, that being the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, they're already involved in a bitter struggle for supremacy in the fur trade. So there was violence during this struggle between these fur companies. And so the one company, if we'll look at the next image, let's learn a little bit about them. Now this struggle was between the Hudson's Bay Company, established in England in 1670, and they were competing with the Montreal-based Northwest Company, or the NWC, who were established around they're actually established around 1780 in the late 1700s. Well, these people already are involved in a bitter struggle over the fur trade. So let's move on to the next image. Now the fur trade, here we see this beautiful little creature here, and these companies, the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company, they were competing to see who of them would get the most of this person or this animal, the beaver, and particularly the pelts. So you could see the beaver there, but you could see his pelt in the other image there. And these pelts of the beaver and other small fur-bearing mammals from the water particularly, these furs were used for the fur trade. And the fur trade was basically for fashion in England. It was all the rich people who wanted beaver pelt hats and such. And this kind of was an indication of social status in Europe at that time. So this was huge. Here we can see some of the hats that the rich people would wear back in those days. So by the year 1600, the need for beaver fur, it exploded. So hence, all the people going to other countries looking for this particular animal. And here in the Canadas, as they called it, or in Prince Rupert's land, they found an abundance of beaver pelts. So hence reason why the British were here. And so, as I mentioned, these beaver pelts were very much desired by the rich in Britain, and hence the whole reason for the fur trade. Now let's look at the next image. Now, we'll learn a little bit about the Hudson's Bay Company. Now the Hudson's Bay Company, if we could look at the next image, they set up in 1670 on the Hudson's Bay, and they actually opened York Factory. Now an interesting note about the Hudson's Bay Company, when they first set up shop on York Factory, for the first 100 years of their operation, they did not deal in liquor. They didn't sell liquor to the native peoples, nor use liquor to entice natives to come to the fort to trade. In 1670, right up until 1770, they only brought in enough liquor to supply their own needs of their men and their officers. So as an example, like in 1770, the most liquor that they brought into that particular post was 250 gallons, and that was just enough, just for their officers and for their men. So at this time during the fur trade, the fur companies weren't really using alcohol to, like I said, entice the natives or as actual items of trade. So during this time, the Hudson's Bay Company was dealing mostly with the Cree and the Assiniboine, and these were the tribes that were going out to other tribes further west to entice them to come in to trade or to get more furs. And during that time, as I mentioned, liquor wasn't really used. So I mean, that's an important note, because that changed a lot after 1770, particularly when this bitter rivalry between the trade companies existed. So let's look at the next image. Now the other company that was part of this was the Northwest Company, and let's learn a little bit about them. Let's look at the next image. And so the Northwest Company, this was founded in 1770 by the Northwest Company. So this company was a major force in the fur trade from about 1780 to about 1821. Now, the makeup of this company was particularly Highland Scots, who weren't particularly friendly with the British. And as a workforce, they had largely French voyageurs, or coureurs de bois is who they would use. And these people had been trading with the native tribes for a long time before the British set up shop in York Factory on the Hudson's Bay. So these people, the Northwest Company had better dealings with the native tribes, and more extensive dealings, and for a longer period of time than the Hudson Bay Company did. So let's actually look at the next image. Now, as I mentioned, the Northwest Company, these were originally Northwest, or they were called Northwesters or Nor'westers. That was a nickname for the Northwest Company traders. And like I mentioned, these were Quebec traders. But the people who were actually running the Northwest Company were Scots, were Highland Scots. So they had the French and the Scottish people working with the Northwest Company from 1780 to 1821. So let's look at the next image. Okay, so this Northwest Company, here's a person a lot of people know, David Thompson. Well, David Thompson worked for both companies. He actually started off with the Hudson's Bay Company, and then he kind of jumped ship with the Northwest Company, and then he kind of went back to the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay weren't very happy with him regarding that. But in any event, it was David Thompson who came out around 1787 and met the Blackfoot. So in 1787, later that year, David Thompson spent the winter with the Piikani, kind of camped near present-day Calgary. And it was at that time that the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company established friendly relations with the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. So as I mentioned, Thompson worked for both companies, and the Blackfoot-speaking peoples kind of knew that there was two different groups of traders in Blackfoot country, and we would use them both to kind of use them off against each other for better prices and such. So I kind of want to point out here that the Northwest Company, when they first set up shop and when they started going head to head with the Hudson Bay Company, they had the advantage, sort of like for the reason as I mentioned, because of the alcohol. Now the Northwest Company, unlike the British, they used alcohol for a long time, decades even before the British, to entice the natives to come to their forts to trade. Or they would actually sell the alcohol to the native peoples as a commodity. So when the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, when they first met, the Northwesters, or the Northwest Company, they had the advantage because they used this excessive distribution of alcohol, both as gifts to lure the natives to the forts and as items of trade. And so at the beginning of this competition, I'd like to point that out, that it was a Northwest Company who kind of initiated the alcohol when it came to trading with the native tribes. So let's look at the next image. Now, the Hudson's Bay Company trade. Now, after 1780, remember in that first slide we were looking at, that when the Hudson Bay Company first set up shop from about 1670 to about 1770, for that first 100 years, they only used liquor for their own people. Well, after 1780, that changed. By actually 1785, the Hudson Bay Company, or the British, they were actually bringing in more than 2,000 gallons. 2,000 gallons a year to their depot at York Factory. And then over time, that increased, particularly by the time the Siksikaitsitapiiks trade was established. Because when that happened, the imports at that post, they became almost 8,000 gallons annually. And that was to supplement the liquor supply that they were already producing out of their own still there at York Factory. So there was a lot of liquor, a lot of alcohol coming out of York Factory onto the plains through the Hudson Bay Company and through the French. So when you think about it there, that one figure, 2,000 gallons a year annually, that is a lot of alcohol to be bringing in, especially when you consider that for the first 100 years, the most they brought in over a year was 250 gallons. That's a lot less than 2,000 gallons. So by this time, now the liquor was becoming firmly established as a part of the trade routine. So let's look at the next image. Now, it wasn't until 1787 that the Hudson Bay Company set up Manchester Post, or Manchester House, on the North Saskatchewan River. Now, this was important to the Blackfoot because now the Blackfoot could trade with Hudson Bay Company traders face to face. And this basically got rid of the middlemen trade. So now we no longer had to go through the middlemen to get trade goods. And in fact, because the middlemen trade was now gone, we weren't restricted as to the things that we could purchase. Now we could purchase firearms, and we can purchase ammunition to go with that, to go with those firearms. And also now we can purchase alcohol, and that may have been a dubious pleasure. Now we can get it, but at the same time, this was the beginning of a lot of social issues, particularly regarding liquor. So this all kind of started around 1786. Now here you can see the Hudson Bay Company post, and you can see them in this map kind of from the Hudson's Bay, making their way inland. And they actually made their way all the way to the Pacific coast. But it wasn't until about 1799 that they made their way as far as Rocky Mountain House and established a trading post. So you can see that over the next few years, the fur traders, they moved farther and farther west, eventually opening Fort Edmonton and Rocky Mountain House in 1799. Now this was the route of the Hudson's Bay Company when they came onto Blackfoot lands. But the Northwest Company traders actually came from Montreal. So you can kind of see that route there. Just above the Great Lakes, they come from Montreal, and then they made their way onto the plains from that direction. And then hence they started to compete with the Hudson's Bay Company all along the North Saskatchewan River. But both these companies, as you can tell from those maps that you saw, they made their way not just into Blackfoot country, but all over Western Canada, even up into the Arctic region. But both of them came into Blackfoot country first on the North Saskatchewan River, because both these companies were actually were looking to open more trade with more tribes, tribes that they didn't know about previously. So let's move on to the next image, actually. So once the traders reached Gitawasin, or our homeland, and established these trading posts, well then our people were able to acquire a regular supply of guns and ammo and alcohol and trade goods. And so it was at this time that the middleman trade was essentially eliminated. We no longer had it. And that wasn't for the good, because the reason why this middleman trade was eliminated was because our people, well, actually, how could I say it? We no longer had to rely on them. We could get trade goods because now we are face to face with the traders on the Saskatchewan River. But a lot of people need to realize that where we first met the white people face to face was way far from where we are today. Like, we were in the North Saskatchewan, almost going into Prince Albert, or past Prince Albert. So that just kind of tells you a little bit about the Blackfoot people, that we weren't just in Alberta, that we were actually living almost to the Manitoba border. So let's look at the next. We got our hides. Now the hides were used for our homes and for some of our bedding, for our clothing, winter clothing particularly, hats and gloves and such and things like that. And there you can see all that dried meat from the buffalo. It's all being dried in the sun. And that meat is going to turn into pemmican, as they know it. And this is what's going to preserve our people in the winter months. Because if anybody's lived in the Calgary region or in Blackfoot country, the seasons actually break down like this. 6 months of cold weather, 6 months of warm weather. And that's because of this ancient battle between Old Man Winter and Thunder, Siksikaitsitapiiks, or the cold maker. But these are part of our stories, our legends. Now here we have our women not just tanning the hides, but they're actually breaking them down. And so there was a lot of work involved with making our homes and our clothing and our implements. But our people knew how to do it, especially when we had ini here. So let's actually go on to the next image. Now here's the buffalo, and this is just some of the reasons. Ini, what we used them for. Well, we used them for our moccasins, for our clothing, for our cradles, for winter robes, our shirts, our leggings. Oh, the list goes on and on. Pipe bags, quivers, teepee covers, itoi covers, I should say, gun covers. We'd use the muscles. When we butchered the animal, we'd use its sinew. And this is what we used to bind our garments and such together, was sinew. And we'd also make, like I mentioned, beef jerky or dried meat. So even the animal's tail we'd use as a brush, a fly, like a whip. You could put the tail in water and splash your rocks inside a sweat lodge. We had a purpose for everything. Even soap, cooking oil came from this animal. Its bones, we make knives, arrowheads, shovels, all sorts of things out of this one particular animal. So this was how important. That's why I say to the Blackfoot speaking peoples, ini was our staff of life. Because he didn't just provide us our food or clothing, but he also had hundreds of other uses. So let's move on to the next picture. So here's some women butchering. We'll kind of go through this kind of a little quickly here. Let's look at the next image. Now here's Madison buffalo jump, and this is within the Blackfoot territories. This is near the Three Forks of the Missouri, but here you can see a picture. This is like Head Smashed In. Our people would have went up top and had to do all that elaborate planning and decoying and such, and then they would drive the animals over the cliffs to their deaths, and then there again it ensured our survival. So this is in Madison. This is actually in the Three Forks of the Missouri, and here's the Ompuskan. That's also a buffalo jump. And that's kind of near, I believe that's kind of southern Montana. I'm not sure exactly which city is closest to it, but this also was a biscan that Blackfoot would use. And like I mentioned, our weaponry is there. So we know that our people have been in all of these places, and we've been hunting ini in these places for literally thousands of years. So let's move to the next image. This one's a Head Smashed In buffalo jump. Of course, this is the most famous. Everybody knows of this place. And this is located in the Porcupine Hills. And our people used to drive the animals off of this biscuit. And the interesting thing about that is the archaeological evidence, of course. There's a period of time where it wasn't used at all. For like 1,000 years, that's a mystery. And we wonder, well, why was that the case? Some people say it was the altithermal time. Maybe it was like a desert out here, so there were no buffalo. It's hard to say. I'd still like to find that out. But for the most part, and you know what's funny, even the Blackfoot stories reflect a time when we were hunting buffalo and then they disappeared. And one of our stories says they had to go through this adventure and get the buffalo released, and then finally there was a buffalo again. So, these kind of stories may seem short and general to general public, but those people who know our traditional ways, they go deeper than that. You realize that, there are some ties here. There is something to the scientific world. Maybe that's what it was, the ultrathermal. But this is the head smashed in buffalo jump, and let's move on to the old woman's buffalo jump. Like I mentioned, in all these different kill sites, our peoples, there's evidence of the Siksikaitsitapiiks being here for thousands of years. And this old woman's buffalo jump, we call it old woman's because according to the ancient stories, this is where our men folk met up with the women folk, and they had their own language, and they had their own ways, and they were doing their own things. And then we agreed, according to the story, to live together. And the weird thing about that is even to this day, our Blackfoot women, Blackfoot speakers, they have words that only they use. And then there's words that only the men would use. So I kind of believe that story. But this is where it all happened, at the old woman's buffalo jump. And this place was discovered maybe back in the, I think it was 1960s by Richard Forbes. And they did a study there. A flood had gone through, and then the flood had washed the bottom of this creek bed and then exposed all of this bone beds that literally went about, I believe it was 27 feet or 9 meters in the one place that they excavated, and they found nothing but bones and arrowheads and regular arrowheads. So yeah, this is the old woman's buffalo jump. Here's some of those points I was talking about that they found at these places. And both these styles, some people say one style was used by the Blackfoot and other tribes used it. That's all baloney, because as Blackfoot people, we would have known our neighbors and we would have even traded with them. So a lot of this stuff here, these points that they find at these kill sites, whether they say plains side notched or plains corner notched, this was Blackfoot weaponry. And there was no indication of other tribes. This was all, like I said, Blackfoot territory, and this was the weaponry that we used because it's evident in all of these different kill sites. So if anybody wants to study that on your own, please feel free and then write back to us and show us your findings. So let's move on to the next part. So here we have kind of that transition now. Now from the dog days, like I mentioned, that was basically untold thousands of years, millennia even, that the Blackfoot people were living in the dog days. And that ended when the horse came, Punokomita. And we received the horse around 1700. And even to the Blackfoot people to this day, they believe that Punokomita, like the dog, was a gift to us from the underwater people, Siksikaitsitapiiks. And that this animal came out of the water, and we started to use this animal the same way we used the dog. As you can see there, now we have a travois for a horse. But we needed longer poles, and hence the lodgepole pine. That's why we use lodgepole pine to this day to set up our nitois, our lodges. And those poles, like I said, they made our homes. Originally when they were on dogs, they made our tents, which were smaller. But these poles that are on the back of the horses are much, much longer. Now, like I mentioned, anywhere from 16 feet to 40 feet. And they would be on the back of these horses, and then we'd leave point A, break camp, and when we got to point B, we'd set up camp, and it was our mothers and our grandmothers who owned nitois. And so they were the ones who were in charge of its maintenance and its keeping, and so they were the ones who put up our homes. And like I mentioned, once the horse came, our homes became much, much larger. Now you're not looking at maybe a 12-foot diameter. Now you've got like 20, 25, 30 feet diameter, and you can sleep 12 people comfortably in some of these new nitois. But here you can kind of see that. You see the dog travois at the bottom there, made out of birch poles that the dog pulled, and then you see the lodgepole pine on the horse, and this is what the Blackfoot used to set up our homes, nitois. So if we go to the next image, we can see that changed, because once we got this animal, our hunting methods changed, but we still used this guns, even up until when the buffalo disappeared and we're no longer, almost extirpated is the big word for it, almost becoming extinct. Well, up until that time, our people hunted this animal, but we used horses now. We'd still round them up and drive them off into the kill sites, but now we could do it faster. And the thing is, now we could cover our land a lot faster. And like I mentioned earlier, we already knew our land intimately, but now when the horse came, we can travel over it a lot faster. If we look at the next image, then you see, the different ways. We'd still be rounding them up on horseback. We'd be herding them, chasing them on horseback, getting them into a herd. So maybe there was less use for the youthful runners as we had in the past. But that's not to say that there's still records, oral history of that happening right up until 1870. So if we look at the next image, we've come to the end of our episode. Here you can see the buffalo being driven over a kill site by men on horseback. And so when the horse came, as I mentioned, it changed our way of life, and that was in effect the end of ito dasi mapiimitakes, the days when we used dogs to move camp from point A to point B. So with that, that's pretty much the end of our program, the end of our broadcast, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I want to point out, if you have any questions, you can comment down on Facebook, or you can send your questions to programs@Blackfoot Crossing. So with that, if you need to contact us, that's the best ways to do it. So remember, COVID's still out there, and other diseases that aren't good for us. So be safe and be good to one another. And with that, Gina Matsin, I'll see you next week.